Welcome to 8 with 8, a podcast from Ohio State Support Team 8, where we share what's on our minds and what's in the research from the field of education. Today, you'll hear from Dee Dee Howes and Stacy Smith, my colleagues at SST8, as they consider ways to restart instruction for students with disabilities from a fresh perspective. They're about to get into the weeds when it comes to instruction for students who have skill gaps or who have missed instruction. But, as you'll soon hear, in this case, getting into the weeds is a good thing.
Hi, I'm Dee Dee Howes, a special education consultant here at SST8, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Stacy Smith. Hi, Stacy. Welcome.
Hey, Deeds. Thanks for having me.
Well, Stacy, I know you and I have talked a lot about what a challenging and unique year this has been in education, and we have had so many questions from the field about missed instruction and what to do when students come back, and really, how do you tackle and address unfinished learning?
That's a great question, Deeds. It really makes me think about when you shared that analogy of weed feeds seed. That really stuck in my mind.
Yeah, it did for me too. You know, back in December, I read this wonderful in-depth article from the Council of Great City Schools, and I attended a webinar series all about addressing unfinished learning in order to provide equitable access to grade level content. And they talked a lot about unfinished learning as it related to the pandemic closures. They used that gardening analogy in a really different way, but even though it wasn't the same way I'm talking about it, what happened was it really prompted my thinking, and it created such a powerful visual in my mind that I realized that it had such great implications, not only thinking about unfinished learning as it relates to kind of coming back to a more traditional learning environment, but I feel like we can use that simple concept for supporting diverse learners that have unfinished learning causing performance gaps all the time. And the fact is that teachers encounter students in that situation every year, not just during a pandemic.
That's such an important point, Dee Dee. We've learned so many lessons from the pandemic that we can carry forward. So let's take a closer look at that analogy, the weed, feed, and seed. What was the weeding referring to?
Yeah, the weeding is really about getting down to the most critical concepts and skills needed within a given standard. So it's not that it's not all important, but we really have to prioritize, and that image of pulling weeds helps us target what's most important by kind of identifying what can we teach to just an awareness level versus what has to be taught with depth of knowledge. And we have to pick the concepts and skills that are linear. And by that, I mean, like, what skills carry over the most from one grade level to another. So we want to make sure that, we're focusing on those things, kind of where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. And I think about like multiplication, that we use that in early elementary, and it carries all the way through to calculus.
So it's really removing the non-critical content, prioritizing. That's definitely been a pandemic lesson. It makes sense to apply here as well. So tell me more about feeding.
Sure. So feeding is really about the teaching, and especially mastery instruction. Kind of first and foremost, we have to be careful not to overly rely on testing. And I know that's such a temptation for us, especially coming back this year, after being out for so long. But we really need to instead identify and address unfinished learning through everyday classroom instruction. We have to make sure that we teach content in the context of grade level assignments and avoid focusing on remediation to address those skill deficits. The problem when we remediate is we're usually teaching those skills then in isolation and out of context. And the fact is that we're far more likely to re-engage prior knowledge when we stick to grade level content and when we teach those missing skills in the context of that grade level content. So it's kind of really about focusing again on that depth of knowledge and not so much on the pacing guide. So the other key idea for feeding is to allow students to learn with and from each other in their natural learning environment. So kind of a given that inclusion is key.
You know, when you said grade level content, it makes me think about Each Child Means Each Child, which is the strategic plan from the Office of Exceptional Children. They really highlighted the importance of setting high expectation, which ties to what you shared about focusing on the depth of knowledge. So the final step is seed. What does that include, Dee Dee?
Well, seeding is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's about planting something that's going to grow. So we have to focus on commonalities among students and approach instruction from an asset lens. So we want to capitalize on students' strengths and their existing skills, and then really promote that shared learning that I talked about. So I like to think about, what are the instructional practices that have worked well, and encourage teachers to spend their time kind of fostering and enhancing those things that have worked well. So it's about cultivating an environment where differences are not viewed as deficits, and again, that all students feel equally valued and capable. It's really critical that even students who are struggling, that they recognize that they just haven't acquired a skill yet. That doesn't mean that they're any less capable than the peers in the classroom. They just are getting there at a little bit different pace. And when we have an environment where everyone realizes that they support each other's learning and kind of all in this together, then everyone wins.
So the power of yet and focus on assets. Such a simple concept, but so powerful. Thanks for sharing those, Dee Dee.
Sure. Thank you, Stacy. I think maybe just to recap, when we think about that unfinished learning that all students or many students come to us with, at different times, it helps us to remember that weed, feed, and feed. So we want to weed by identifying the most critical concepts and skills in the standard. And then we want to feed by sticking again to that grade level content within context and kind of avoid remediation. And finally, we want to feed by nurturing students' strengths and interests in that safe learning space that we want to create. And I really encourage teachers to capitalize on the practices that work well and the things that they've learned over the past year and a half about new ways to teach students. I feel like we hear almost on a daily basis about what districts and educators have learned during the pandemic about creative ways to motivate students and engage them and new ways to use technology. So I hope people will really grab a hold of those things and move forward with them. So I guess it's kind of time to get out the gardening tools and put on our gloves and do some weed, feed, and feed.
And that's it for another episode of 8 with 8. If you'd like to learn more about how to weed, seed, and feed, head on over to our website, sst8.org/podcast.aspx. You'll find a recording when this concept was shared at our Special Education Forum, as well as links to the article and webinar that Dee Dee referenced. And as always, be sure to join us next week. We'll be joined by Tracy Mail from our SST8 team, along with a colleague from another SST region, talking about resetting our ideas around assessment accessibility. See you soon.